friends! Today I am painting these salty pretzels and I am painting them on Arches cold press watercolor paper. I start by sketching out the pretzels just so that I can get a good shape and make sure everything's proportionate. And I wanted to have about 3.5 pretzels, so I make sure that one of them is kind of broken, and I will paint in some crumbs and things later on. A little bit of salt too, because you know how the salt always falls off of your pretzels when you're eating them. This is masking fluid. It is what you use on your paper if you want something to remain white while you paint over it, and then later you can just use an eraser to remove it. I'm using this to keep white spots for where the salt will be. So I just use a not so good brush to put this on because your brush will get kind of gummed up. I make sure I dry it so it doesn't smear. Then I'm going to start with my Princeton round size 4 brush. I love this brush. It's one of my go-to brushes, and I'm just going to start with some light washes over each pretzel. And again, that masking fluid will eventually rub off and I will have white specks for where the salt will be. So I'm just doing these light washes over all the surface area of the pretzels, making sure I get the shape right. Now, as that's a little bit wet, I will add some darker brown in there, and I'm doing it wet on wet so that it's softer, so I don't have any hard lines between the colors. I'm adding that in places that I know are darker, like the little edges and where some of it's going to be shaded later on. So then I just basically continue to add on slowly and build up my color. With watercolor, you can't go back and paint in lighter areas, so you have to make sure that you keep your lighter areas and your highlights as best as you can. So I'm painting around the areas that are raised higher and the light's hitting. Then I'm going to make sure I dry it occasionally so that I can get some cleaner lines as well. And again, I'm just continuing to add in a little bit more detail. This is a tiny little Princeton brush. It's a little bit longer and very skinny. I'm going to use this to, again, just keep layering in some of those shadows on those inner corners. My light source is coming from the top left, which you'll see when I put the shadows in later. So I use this brush to go even darker, and then sometimes I'll just dip in a little water and soften the edge of that darker brown that I'm using. And I just continue to do that. Okay, so I'm erasing any pencil marks, and you can see the masking fluid came right off. Now there's those white spots for the salt. I'm adding the crumbs, and I'm softening around where the salt will be because pretzel salt isn't usually bright white. It usually kind of gets baked into the pretzel a little bit, so it has a softer look to it. I leave tiny parts of it white, but some of it just kind of gets blended in with the pretzel. And then I add a little bit of shading around the salt because it is raised some. So it does produce a little bit of a shadow and texture on the pretzel. So once I soften it in, then I go back and add a little bit of a shadow around the salt. So it looks like a coarse salt. Put a little salt on the background there. And just some final little touches. Make sure it's nice and dry. And that's a white colored pencil. Sometimes I use that just to add a little bit of a highlight, a bright white highlight. Now I'm adding some shadows. And this is what really brings it to life. You can see that my light source is coming from the top left. And that's about it. Dry it up. And we are finished. So these are the pretzels. Total, it probably took me about 30 minutes, and I'm pretty happy with them. They're about life size. Check out my Instagram for more work. Have an awesome day, guys.